Okay, Chris, let's go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone. This is Randy Sandell. I'm the Executive Director here at the Critical Infrastructure Resilience Institute. I'm delighted to welcome you all to the first ITI CIRI webinar of the new academic year. Delighted that you're here. Today's presentation will be supply chain security in an asymmetric era. This is a very important topic. I think we've all seen the headlines in the newspaper and discussion about Huawei and the concerns about 5G. And I think it's very appropriate that we start the academic year, our first webinar, with a discussion of the threat environment, which is what we'll have today. I am particularly pleased to introduce today's speaker, Mr Nissen from Mitre. He is well known to CIRI because he is such an expert in the field of asymmetric threat and response. I personally love to hear his talks, and I know you'll find his talk is extremely interesting and thought-provoking. I usually have two responses to his talks when I hear them. The first is typically, wow, that was very interesting and informative. And the second response is typically something like, holy crap, that was really scary. And I'm really delighted to introduce him today. I think you'll find that his talk extremely interesting and very thought-provoking. Chris is currently the Director of Asymmetric Threat Response and Supply Chain Security at Mitre Corporation. He has 30 years of experience in developing solutions for extremely complex national security challenges. In his current role, he works across the corporation, developing essential strategic elements to address non-kinetic, full-spectrum asymmetric threats to national security, both in the public and the private sectors. He's previously served as the Director of Communications and Networking Technical Center, leading a division of over 230 engineers and a diverse portfolio of programs and technology development spanning microelectronics to satellite communications. So he's clearly an engineer's engineer. Some of his accomplishments include putting forth an original vision for the development of an anti-jam capability for the nation's GPS system, development of implementation of several special communication techniques. Most recently, Chris led a senior study team that produced the report Deliver Uncompromised, a strategy for supply chain security and resilience in response to the changing character of war. It's available online. I strongly encourage you to read it if you haven't. Just Google Deliver Uncompromised, and I'm sure you'll find it. Chris holds a bachelor's in electrical engineering and a master of science in electrical engineering, and also has a background in structured analytical techniques. With no further ado, let me introduce Mr Nissen.
Thank you very much, Randall. It's truly a pleasure to be back with your organization. I was out in University of Illinois in person, probably, I don't know, now 4 or 5 months ago. And it's always a pleasure to do these talks. Because what I'm going to talk about today, you know, the title that you read is the one that sent. It is the title of the talk. I just wanted to underscore. I decided to put in the front slide, Deliver Uncompromised, so provoking. And the underpinning of that is really, you know, bottom line up front is the era of globalism is fundamentally changing. And by that, I mean that we are entering into an era where global trust of all third-party transactions, and that's what supply chain comes down to, is experience a fundamental change in that when you once thought you could trust the third party, now you really can't. And we'll go into depth as to why and what's behind this. So my contact information here is accurate. You can always reach out to CIRI and Randall, and happy to have follow-on conversations or discussions. So I'm gonna go through the basic fundamental underpinnings of what Deliver Uncompromised is about, and that is, you know, a strategy for supply chain security. But to me, supply chain security really boils down to unknown third-party risk. And we're going to talk about why it's so important and why there's been so much momentum. Much of it, I will say, unabashedly, somehow by this report. I think we just kind of put it succinctly as to what's going on. So I'll try to keep this to maybe 35 minutes or so, and leave some time for Q&A at the end. This talk I could do for 2.5, 3 hours. So I'm going to have to hit some topics relatively quickly, but to everyone online, please just make notes and feel free to ask questions at the end. Let's go ahead here. All right. This is a slide that I really made up about 4 years ago. Deliver Uncompromised, the report came out about a little under 1.5 years ago. And it was a recognition back then, thinking big globally, that we're really at the dawn of a new era. We had a study at MITRE. MITRE, by the way, is a nonprofit, very, very, we are a research organization. We're a system engineering house. We're a nonprofit that owns and operates 7 what's called federally funded research and development centers across government. So we're a private company that works in the nation's interest, and we have a special, closely inherent government function. So we're very well connected with the R&D community, and we do a fair amount of R&D, all in the nation's interest. So we were asked to kind of think about, my group was asked to think about, what do we really need for the next era of conflict? And what we were really being asked was, what should we purchase and pre-deploy overseas? People weren't thinking fundamentally. And this slide came out of that within about the first week or two, and I realized very quickly that it's really a home game more than it is an away game. This is sort of a integration for the engineers out there, an integration and dump function, and just kind of clicked that we're at the dawn of a new era. So I am not a, I only like to use slides, and I use them more in a webinar than I do in person, so that you can read them. I'm not going to read them, but the point here is, we've really had 3 major eras at a large scale, and you can debate the dates, but fundamentally they were a nuclear era. Took us a few decades to build that up, and it was underscored by strategic nuclear deterrence. That's eroding today for a number of reasons, and the little bullets there to the right of the nuclear era operating environment kind of dominates. It was a much different world then, right? U.S. power projection, power centralization, a secure and industrial base. The Pentagon would refer to that as the first offset. It was followed by a conventional era, the ability for the West to maybe engage in 2 conflicts on 2 continents simultaneously. It again took us a few decades to build up, and there was no question as to the dominance that we had in the conventional deterrence. That conventional deterrence isn't today what it was then. Some of that's deliberate in a drawdown of sorts. Our military is at a kind of a record low in terms of personnel for a whole number of reasons. But the point is that second offset, that conventional era, was so strong that it drove our nation state adversaries into really not wanting to engage us kinetically. They will if they have to, they prepare to if they have to, but they really don't want to. And that caused a fundamental shift beginning in the late 80s, early 90s, where they had decided to engage us what we call asymmetrically. And we're going to define asymmetrically for you very concisely on the next page. But the general point here is that while the DoD would be considering the third offset behind conventional to be technology, we were saying, no, that's not quite right. We're in a new era. It's going to take us a few decades because we're a couple decades behind in even recognizing that that was the adversary's intention. And hence, we're in an asymmetric era. And guess what? We have no comprehensive asymmetric deterrence. And so that is sort of the North Star. How do you deter some of these asymmetric attacks, of which supply chain is a major attack vector? And we'll talk about that. It really goes way beyond defense. If you look at the attacks in the private sector, sometimes for financial gain, oftentimes not. The OPM data breach, the Marriott data breach. Those were not really economic-based attacks. They were attacks to some would proffer in the open source by China ultimately to gain treasure troves of information for which they can apply machine learning and AI and advanced detection techniques to really hone targeting for these asymmetric actions they're taking. It's a much bigger problem, and there's a lot of interesting research problems underneath it for this community. But really, our responses are limited because this asymmetric theory that they have enables them to work in between the seams of our democracy. So they know exactly where the policies and authorities exist in the United States legal system to take advantage of our privacy protections, our non-surveillance on our own citizens, the protections that U.S. corporations enjoy. And that really makes it difficult because at the end of the day, if one imagines, wow, they're in our healthcare system or they're in our energy distribution systems, and they can make those systems not do what they're supposed to do when they need to do it, well, they're actually in violation of the Geneva Convention, and they're putting non-armed, non-combatant citizens at risk. Yet our response still largely corresponds to the Geneva Convention. That is, we will not do the same to their citizens, and we will whatever we do will be reversible. It's a real problem, and that's called legally retorsion. Our only other response, and you read it in spy novels and in movies, and it's not really quite like that in real life, but is called reprisal, and that's, well, we're going to ignore international convention, and we'll make it plausible deniability. That's technically called a covert action. The problem is it really doesn't scale, not even close to what they're doing to us. So we really have a fundamental shift here in that the private sector, as well as the hundreds of thousands of companies that support the defense industrial base, are all at risk, because above what I'm going to talk about today, which is technical operations, how do you get into a system and exploit it, and why you do that, above that is a larger economic war. And that's why you see, China making large economic moves. And I say China, but you also have Russia and Iran and North Korea, all for different strategic tempos, all for different strategic reasons. So you have to look at each of them in a certain lens. But China is kind of unprecedented in its move with Made in China 2025 and their 13th five-year plan and their long-term national strategy to become the global power. So the bottom line is our businesses, our private sector, are carrying massive unknown operational risks, and they're able to exploit those at scale. And this isn't just cyber IT, and that's a key thing. So in the research community, there's a lot of energy going toward cyber defenses and cyber capabilities. But if you look at the ROI of the cyber sector, it seems like it's a losing war. We're really struggling there, and that's because cyber is only one dimension of how they're tending to move. So from a my background in counterintelligence and studying the problem at a large scale, when you get into technical operations, there's really four basic ways of coming in. And an adversary will move in and out of these as a function of opportunity, capability, access, strategic intent, even deception. And those four are cyber IT, which everybody knows. You can't run a company today without at least doing due diligence and securing your IT systems. But the other three that have drawn little attention in the corporate world until lately are the human element, that's witting or unwitting, ICS or cyber physical systems, operational technology, What I've got depicted there with that little very simplified version of the produce stack is, basically real-time systems, right? So anything with a real-time deadline. And for the R&D community, that's something that needs a lot of attention, right? Because the underlying, so a real-time system, that could be right, the sensors and actuators of the flight control surfaces and the engines, the programmable logic control layer, maybe the avionics, the human-machine interface is the cockpit displays. SCADA, which you hear a lot of people say, oh, it's a SCADA attack, is really just a WAN. Doesn't apply a whole lot to an aircraft, but it certainly does when you take this model and apply it to, say, an industrial system where, an industrial process may be global. It may maybe just be a large factory, and they interconnect all of the real-time systems from the beginning chain to the end, whether you're making exquisite ball bearing or engine turbine fans to vehicles. That SCADA system, or an excellent example there is in the electrical energy distribution system over very long distances. That's a particularly hard problem because they're real-time deadlines, and that real-time deadline can't fail. So you can't take best practices from IT, like encryption and authentication, and just throw it on a real-time system, because then all the adversary has to do is corrupt a few bits, and authentication or the encryption fails, and the real-time deadline fails. And that can be very catastrophic in a real-time system, whether, in the examples I gave. And the fourth one may be a little confusing because I set it off to the side there, and I call supply chain, but I specifically call out software, hardware, and services. And a lot of people forget about services. And when I say supply chain security, I really mean drawing a circle around all four of these and saying these are the venues of which they move in and out of as a function of space and time. But we call it supply chain because everyone can grapple their mind around that. So services can be anybody from a subcontractor working in your facility to guess what? The product has gone out the door and it's being shipped and it's manipulated in transit, or vice versa. So it's a broad way of thinking. And if you look at an example that we've seen in the open source for quite a while now, something like Stuxnet, if all you're doing in that case, if all the Iranians have been doing was looking at their cyber IT network, they miss the attack, right? Because in that case, what we learned from open source is an insider, witting or unwittingly, carried a thumb drive into the facility and plugged it into the programmable logic control. It then infected that OT system, told the centrifuges, sensors and actuators, to do one thing, and told the human-machine interface they were doing another. So it went completely undetected for many years because they weren't using this framework. So it really is kind of a holistic way of looking at it, and how you address each of these areas is very, very different. Cyber OT, because of the physical investment we have in serial protocols, many of which are going on 3/4 of a century old, 1553 bus, Modbus, they have to be fundamentally redesigned. They're going to come out of, that will come out of, not the cyber community as much as the communications and networking community. And there's some excellent work going on in areas like software domain networking, name domain networking, that are looking at protocols to run operational networks, ICS networks, in a secure way to contain an event when it happens and not make it systemic. So when I say supply chain security, I'm really wrapping a circle around all of these, this entire venue here. This is I won't spend a lot of time on this, but one of the fundamental underpinnings is it really requires a broad whole of society approach. I say that, on the right-hand side there, the general framework behind our work is technology, policy, and legislation. Technology and policy, because if you're the CEO of a company or the director of an agency, government agency or other agency, you can pretty much bring technology and policy to bear as needed, but without some legislative changes, it's going to be hard to do. What do I mean by legislative? Well, personal, privacy exemptions are ones. It's really hard to go after the insider threat problem if you're not allowed to look at US persons. Also, companies that have vulnerabilities also have a obligation under Securities and Exchange Commission law to divulge those risks to their operation, to their shareholders. That puts them in a very difficult spot to share information, to even share information with researchers to help drive toward better solutions. So the framework requires a lot of work in all three of those. Me personally, and at the end of this talk, I'll get on to what's changed recently and some of the things we're working on. I've been spending a lot of time in the private sector with collaborating with private sector entities that are trying to defend their enterprises and starting to build an ecosystem of private companies that bring different types of talent to that problem. And one of the reasons we need to do that is because you're kind of hamstrung if all your research is coming from federal dollars, because there are restrictions on where that money comes from and the kind of work that you can do. So we're really thinking 50,000 foot level here. How do we change the world at scale? To the diagram, the Venn diagram, it's really important to recognize that these are embedded, persistent threats. That is, if the full force of the People's Republic of China government comes after you, it's going to be kind of hard. You're not going to win that, right? But the point is, you can shrink that intersection down so it's not a systemic failure. It's contained, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in another slide or two. But that Venn diagram is really the culmination of these three areas. One is the technical feasibility of the attack. A lot of emphasis, and engineers tend to gravitate toward, how can we make it technically more difficult? But the point is, there's also two more really important sections to that. One is what information is out in the public domain that they can do surveillance and reconnaissance on. MITRE has an attack model. If you're not familiar with it, go look at it. And part of that model shows, the steps required in cyber IT to attack a system, from initial surveillance all the way through operations and maintaining positive control of the operation over a long duration of time. Their ability to do that in a Western system where we live in an era of transparency and information sharing and collaboration is much easier than us being able to do that back to them. Why? They can go on the internet and find out incredible amounts of information. For instance, it was at a DEF CON conference a couple years ago, thanks to Collins putting their avionics information, their technical operations, and their design manuals on the internet. Exploits were developed by hackers just for demonstration purposes against airplanes based on openly available information. And you think about it, and there's really no reason to just hand that information. So controlling that information and what you're telling the rest of the world, and even your suppliers in the long run, is a really critical point to minimizing that information sector. That's another really important area for R&D. How can we better facilitate the collaborative effort between suppliers and manufacturers, and yet maintain manufacturing efficiencies? Let me give you a specific example. If you're sending a board out to a company that's going to manufacture a printed circuit board, that's going to manufacture it or maybe populate a part of it, you really don't necessarily have to take, and you don't want to, in terms of this, have the entire thing silk screened to the point where, okay, this is the crypto module that goes here, and this is the power module that goes here. You're already kind of handing them a schematic of the thing, but you're sharing more information than the one subcontractor really needs to do what you're hiring them to do. So it really is an important point. The access is everything from physical to electronic to human. So they really need all three of those areas to be able to execute an attack. And if we were to draw this diagram to scale, the entire screen would be yellow, and I would have to be explaining what the blue and green and kind of pink thing is outside the view graph. And what we want to do in time to move toward asymmetric deterrence is shrink that yellow part down so that when you are attacked, it's, like I said, it's not systemic. If you think about what Kaspersky did, which is all in the open domain now, you know, they basically said, trust us, give us root access to your hard drives, and we'll protect it. And what it was really doing was getting them, according to the United States government, and they've won 2 lawsuits over it, it was really giving them unfettered access to suck information off of your hard disk. And if you suck that off of 500 million hard disks and you collate it and you apply AI and ML in a way like Google would, you know, there's this concept of classification by aggregation. You get an incredibly deep and rich view of what's going on across all of those disks. And many of them are complete private sector businesses that give you exquisite business intelligence. That's a systemic failure. And there's other ways of infiltrating those into your system. So what I think the engineering community is going to have to do is go back toward how do we design resilient systems that take advantage of technology, yet don't expose these systemic failures, these systemic attack vectors? How do we break up that aggregation of information? You know, you kind of go back to the Apollo days when we would design systems with independent supply chains, independent design teams, and use something like simple majority voting to make a decision. Should one sensor versus another? We don't do that in many of our weapon systems today. We don't do it in many of our aircraft systems today, and it's because of cost. So you're fundamentally trading off cost for security because we were in a globalist trust environment. And as we shift from that, I think we can use the advantages of Moore's law and increased processing power rate, decreased costs, but to arrive at safer, more resilient systems. But it needs a change in the way we teach our engineers to think about design decisions and attempt to still meet the same price point. So this is a really important slide in terms of this really isn't a threat briefing from what can, you know, a nation state adversary do to you. I was talking about motivations up until now, but really comes down to risk, and this is an age-old equation. You know, it's really threat, vulnerabilities, and consequences. And the real message here is that it's really 3 different disciplines that it takes to assess risk. And I've yet to meet a company that's really applying this holistically. Threat requires, you know, it's the intent and capability of the adversary. It's requiring someone almost with a counterintelligence background or a business intelligence background. It really does require an understanding of what these entities are capable of. So let's call that a counterintelligence background. Vulnerabilities is an engineering background. The engineers that design the software system or the hardware system or the overall system need to really consider, well, geez, you know, we put all this protection around this special part, you know, the crypto or whatever, the communications. In reality, the whole thing would fail if they just attacked the power supply. So the power supply is left completely exposed, very easy target, and you harden one part of the system and you left another system exposed. And consequences is really the operator, the end user of the system. If I lost this capability, does my mission, whatever that is, it may be military, it may be financial, it may be the ability to move energy, doesn't matter. If I lose that capability, is that a failure, or is it a mission failure, or can I fight through it? Can I operate in a degraded state? Not at full, not at optimum, but I can kind of hobble through. So we look at risk that way, and at the end of the day, you know, you need to balance risk. The private sector and the government needs to assess risk and spend the minimum amount of money to get the maximum amount of protection. But because we haven't been thinking of it this way, our risks are very high, hence the name of the report saying, you know, just read the OIG reports, the OSD IG reports, the GAO reports, system after system after system that the Defense Department have acquired have been compromised coming out of the gate before they're ever even delivered. And the same thing happens in the private sector. We just don't think about it. Kaspersky really illuminated it. You're seeing all this energy about Huawei and ZTE, and there's a reason why they would like access and placement in the backbone of the 5G network and in other places. It gives them systemic capability. So you need to, well, I'll say enough about that. At the bottom, we talk about the life cycle of a supply chain, and what you can do in the different phases of the life cycle are vastly different, and some of them are much cheaper and easier, and they require different techniques. So the first place is concept, right? When you first start thinking about the problem, start protecting it. I've seen cases where what is eventually going to be an exquisite national capability is being discussed in open emails. So already we're leaving the option of adversaries being able to figure out, what their collection target should be, whether that's technical or human or what. But all the way through concept, design, manufacture to retirement, that's an opportunity for an adversary to come in, and you get the biggest bang for your buck if you start at the beginning, through concept and design and manufacture before you start fielding the device. Once it's fielded, if you've got a fleet of Navy vessels that have been out there for 20 years, and they're very difficult to recall and get in the maintenance depots and make changes, that's a much more difficult problem than if you protected it at the forefront. Likewise with retirement, with technology today, many devices are trained out in 18, 24, 36 months. That's a pretty short cycle if a nation state adversary is wishing to collect intelligence on you. So they may be very happy to say, you know what, this is kind of hardened down. What I'll do is I'll buy their scrap. I'll strategically get there to get the device when it's taken out of life cycle, and then I'll withdraw the information that it's collected. So there is no real-time connection at that point. So it really is kind of thinking about, well, how much of a target am I? Where do I sit in the ecosystem, and what is my risk, so that you can make intelligent protection techniques. I won't go through this slide, but I really wanted to put an example of the depth that falls within that life cycle. Many of you are researchers, so when you think about the concept and the design and the prototyping, we've listed there below those three areas some of the attack vectors that can be executed, and very little to no attention is paid to many of those traditionally. That's not true today. There are a few companies that I'm really impressed with leaning forward. I'm not going to mention who they are, but we'll talk a little bit about that. So the life cycle is real, and it's pretty deep. Let me back here. I forgot to mention, I thought I had a slide in here that I don't. What do I mean by asymmetric? The way we define it is there's really four ways of fighting, right? It's win by fighting, win by not fighting, win by not losing, and disrupting. So win by fighting is kinetic. The other three are asymmetric, and in the grand strategy, they'll move in between those three. So if you start thinking that way, South China Sea makes a lot of sense, right? Win by not losing is win by not fighting is South China Sea, right? You lower the international acceptance for safe navigable waters, and then you start building up a strategic advantage with islands that are in international waters. You never fought, yet you gained strategic ground, both physically and technically. So that's win by not fighting. Win by not losing, it's guerrilla warfare, it's ISIS, it's death by 1,000 cuts, and it can make us get in a very tactical versus a strategic mode. Win by disrupting is a lot of what we're talking about in technical operations. And an adversary will want to infiltrate a system or a capability for a number of reasons. Some of the most primary are to do technical collection, the Kaspersky example I gave, to just gather information in a systemic way. Another might be just to steal IP to gain an economic advantage, which will eventually lead to a physical or manufacturing advantage or research advantage. And another one is to truly disrupt. That is, make a system not do what it's supposed to do when it's supposed to do it. So, you know, it becomes a really provocative question to say, well, what is a response? And in the report, to an adversary action, right? So in the report, we talk about the ability, this allows the adversary to asymmetrically stop, if not reverse, the commander's intent, even up to the president, right? So, you know, there was an example, you know, a few years ago, we were bombing Syria. Well, what if, while it was occupied by Russia, what if Russia's response, they didn't respond at all, really, other than through diplomatic means, but what if their response had chosen to not be kinetic, that is, shoot back at us? We weren't shooting at them, of course, but what if their response had been to start attacking our infrastructure inside the United States in a misattributable way? That is, make it look like someone else did it. I concur, I contend it wouldn't take many of those attacks before the president says what's going on, and there's no one sitting around the cabinet being able to tell him, and that has moved some very big pieces on a global chessboard all through disruption attacks. And that is why there's such an interest from the adversaries. They can spend a relatively little amount of money to gain a huge strategic advantage that we've been traditionally employing in kinetic warfare. So I apologize for leaving that slide out after this. So, man, the time goes fast. I can't believe that we're already at 2:39. So I'm going to use this slide as just a few updates on some things that are going on, and then open it up to some questions. So since the report came out, I've made a few recognitions that, look, you know, this problem really can't be addressed solely inside government. In fact, I would argue that 80% of the solutions are going to come from the private sector. The future of these solutions are these attacks are coming as 0 days, signatureless, boundaryless. So intelligence, quote unquote, as we've formally known it, inside, you know, coming from the government to the private sector, that has peaked and is diminishing, because the real intelligence is existing in privately owned and operated infrastructure. Those companies are out there trying to make money, they're trying to keep their businesses operating, and they don't have the tradecraft and the talent necessarily to be able to even detect what's going on in their networks. With this emphasis on third-party risk, and I contend that we are moving into an era where within the next 10 years, and it's already starting to happen, as the leader of a company today, you have to be at least doing due diligence in cyber IT. You don't have to be doing due diligence in supply chain. And that is going to fundamentally shift. It's going to shift because there is a definite movement on the behalf of the government and an increasing awareness in the private sector that, wow, our customers aren't going to stand for this, our shareholders aren't going to stand for this, our investors aren't going to stand for this, and our liability is increasing. So the risk committees of their boards aren't going to stand for this. So an investment in third-party risk is kind of moving from the cost column into the benefit column. And I have spent the last year, we are entering into some strategic collaborations with private sector companies that are interested in scoring and risk assessing the risk of elements of their supply chain. And to accomplish that, we're collaborating with third-party entities that can bring unique capabilities to the table. And I know of four companies now that their CEOs have read the report, 2 have reorganized according to the report and saying, you know what, we're moving the CISO out, and we're moving mission assurance to include these unknown risks, right? So mission assurance is typically making engineering calculations and decisions to manage risk based on engineering solutions. And what they've realized from this work is that what we weren't considering is this unknown risk, this stuff out here that could get us and kill our mission that we weren't considering. So they're repositioning the company to start making investments in that, and they believe that it'll be a real differentiator, kind of like, you know, some people will buy a Volvo or a Mercedes because they do better in crash test results. So I'll pay a little bit more to get that increased physical security. They're doing the same thing with their companies. And I think that's the beginning of a trend that is really starting to take off. In addition, there's several initiatives in the DoD and the United States government that's moving in that direction. I'm sure you've probably all heard in the DoD of the cybersecurity module coming out of OSD ANS. You know, it's in its infancy. It's out for draft. If you haven't read it, it's an interesting read. And the interesting thing about it is it says the what, not the how. And I think that's really important. You know, when government starts dictating, here's how you secure, that's probably not a real good idea. If you say, here's the end results that we want, here's what we want secured, and leave it up to technology and the industry to make those decisions as to how to manage their risk and their vertical, that's really good. They're also starting to branch outside of just cyber IT, right? They're starting to point in some of their requirements toward managing insider threat and unknown human risk, who you're doing business with. The third point is really important. I'm putting a lot of time and energy into this inside MITRE and working with private sector companies that are just have incredible capability in this area, and that's continuous monitoring. So if you do an assessment of your supply chain or your relationship risk, you know, and you put a bunch of time and energy to that, and you write a report, and it's done. Pretty much the minute it's done, you can ask the question the next day, well, is that posture still the same? Is it the same 2 weeks later? Is it the same 3 weeks later? The answer is no, it's not. And we're working on a model right now that we'll probably be releasing on what is a proven track record of how, for instance, China targets a company and then moves through it. So continuous monitoring is a very, very interesting technical problem, and the scoring of risk as a function of time is really interesting. Information sharing is a really important aspect of this. Our recommendation in the report was to stand up something called the National Supply Chain Intelligence Center. You know, DHS plays a major role in information sharing with the private sector. So we interact a lot with CISA, and that is really important. There's some work going on there that hopefully how we share information bilaterally between the public and private sector will be fundamentally changing. It's also a bipartisan issue. You know, Senators Warner and Crapo and several others are really behind that general move, and I think you're going to be seeing, you know, an increase in legislation in this direction. So the final thing is, happy to talk with anybody, you know, afterwards to go in much more depth. This went much quicker than I expected it to, and I want to kind of wind down. We are collaborating with a number of entities, and we're happy to look at additional ones as we move forward. So I'll open it up for any questions that anyone may have. Randall?
Yeah, be sure to unmute yourself if you have any questions. Okay, Chris, I had one, kind of kick things off. Where do you see, or do you see value in the adherence to the NIST standards with respect to some of these threats, particularly in the cyber IT space?
Yeah, sure. So I would, for a long time, I've called them necessary but not sufficient. That's sort of a foundation. You got to be doing that. And if you haven't taken a look at OSD's cybersecurity maturity model, you really want to, the latest instantiation, because in it, I think they take that same approach. They lay it out as a foundation, and they hired, I think, Carnegie and APL to do that work. And what they do is they lay on top of it recommendations for a next set of NIST standards, and then they start putting in the framework for another set of sort of DIB standards that might come from OSD.
Right.
So it's a good foundation, necessary and not sufficient. If you're 800-171 compliant all the way down the line, and a surprising number of companies aren't, if you are, okay, you're a little harder, and you're getting maybe the low-hanging fruit, but again, that's cyber IT, and we need to go beyond that.
Great. Thank you.
All right, this is David Nicolai. It took me a while to find the panel and to unmute and so on and so forth. Very interesting talk. Thank you very much. A question that I have is, we are here at a university, and I'm wondering what your thoughts are on what role universities have in trying to address some of the problems that you came up with.
Many. One is, universities, they have a culture of international collaboration and sharing. So they are also, if you lay out the major attack vectors, they are one, right? There are cases where in the corporate world, an adversary will work really hard to get somebody embedded in the corporate IR&D program, because then they're there and they see everything. And they might do that through a collaboration. They might do it through a university collaboration. So that's one obvious one, and it's not an easy one, I grant it, but I've had a few discussions with a couple of universities that are really starting to look hard at that. And that's a tough one to grapple with, but it's something that is probably the lowest hanging fruit. But in the R&D area, it wouldn't be hard to put together a tech roadmap just in those 4 dimensions I mentioned, right? So you can look at DARPA, and they've got stuff going on in say microelectronic security. They've got stuff going on, programs going on, and that are very impressive, near real-time cyber IT detection, not globally, but at least across CONUS. So, if I were in charge of a university R&D program, I would, depending on the university and depending on, what my specialization was or where the bulk of our R&D was, I would look across those 4 sectors and say, well, which ones are we most naturally gravitated for? And really build a roadmap of, I think of that in terms of a radar plot, right? With the center being today and the edge maybe being 10 years out, and look at the investments in R&D that are being made in maybe 6 or 7 domains within that. Take insider threat detection, or take cyber OT, or one element of supply chain. How do you really know where your software is coming from? SBOM is a perfect example, right? Software bill of materials, and lay that out and say, wow, what are the probabilities? Because there's a lot, there's the Gartner curve, right? There's a lot of hype with certain capabilities that come out, but kind of lay out and track, between today and 10 years out or 5 years out. A, where are there holes? Because that may be where I want to do some research. And B, where, if any of these become reality, does it become an absolute game changer in that domain? Or even a moderate game changer. So again, I tried to give some examples in OT. I think we really have a major problem there. And I think the only real so you can do R&D that's going to be applicable for brand new systems or systems that are 30 years out, but say we want to get serious about really making avionics secure. Man, that's hard, right? It's harder physically and economically than it is technically. if you want to change the protocols, and you want to change the 1553 bus, and you want to change how avionics talk. But it's not as hard if you want to push out the event detection and start applying machine learning and AI to figuring out you got a problem before something bad happens, right? So the purpose of this talk at the 50,000 foot level is to recognize where the adversary is moving. And to answer your question, at in an open forum like this, I would zoom in and then do a survey of where should we be making investments. I particularly, everybody's got their preference. I particularly like to look at gray areas and the white space in between where investments are being made, and see if we can fill some of that gap. I hope that helped. It's kind of hard at that level, but we could talk more privately if you like.
Yeah, well, thanks very much. I see that there's someone that has a question under chat, so I'll let whoever's handling chat deal with that.
Yeah, Chris, there is a chat question, and the question is, can you say more about the deterrence piece? Are you just saying that security and resilience are deterrence threats?
No, you can't win the game by only defending your goal. There's no question. You start there, right? The North Star is comprehensive deterrence. And absolutely not. I think the future of intelligence is moving to the private sector. I think the future of deterrence is moving to the private sector. And I've run into a few CISOs that are taking active means of deterring adversaries from affecting their companies. One example is one guy told me he's very, very active. He's got a team of 7, 24/7 in the dark web, basically creating this persona that, man, you don't mess with company X because they're badass, right? That's in the long run, they're just pushing the adversaries off to the companies in his vertical, left or right. But I do think that there's some interesting active techniques you can take. And there's a couple of startups out there that I've heard of that are doing that in the cyber domain, that instead of just, detecting that they're being attacked and trying to plug a port, they're pulling they're basically using pretty advanced deception techniques to let them come in, mess with their code which goes out, run a little information operation on them by giving them payloads to take away that are completely false and misleading. I absolutely think that to North Star, we have to start fighting back aggressively. But we're bleeding as a country by being so open. So this talk is largely about how do we start closing some of that up. But I think right behind it, there's a wave that we're going to see in the private sector, and that would be another very interesting area for the R&D world to approach. For instance, one of our ideas is create for OT networks. There's no reason to just you couldn't have a network that looks like a real network, right? And that's not easy to do. We actually put a fair amount of effort, several staff months into figuring out what it would take to do that. Very interesting research problem, very applicable to industry. You could maybe set that up on an industrial front and lure the adversaries into those environments and just confuse the heck out of them. So no, and actually fingerprint code and take it back to them and be much more aggressive. I'm not going to go any farther than that, but absolutely, you can't do that. You can't win a game by just defending your own goalposts.
Great. There's another question on the chat, and it is, the report describes 15 COAs, I'm assuming as courses of action, that the nation should take. What are the cost implications of doing all that? 10% increase in costs, or maybe 1,000%? Please comment.
Yeah, so again, we wrote that report at DoD because DoD, well, superficially directed at DoD because DoD spends in the government $750 billion on supply chain every 4 years, over every palm cycle. So you can't ignore them. But you could scratch out DoD and write USG. You could scratch out USG and write private sector. So the whole point of fourth pillar is we acquire systems right now. And we do this in the private sector too, right? Traditionally on cost, schedule, and performance. And the point is, you know, if you're going to spend X billion dollars or X trillion dollars in the DoD example to get 135 F-35s that are all compromised and don't work, would it make more sense to only buy 90 that do work? And that cost differential between the 135 and 90 went into making the 90 secure? I think so. And that is directly the government saying, why should we be accepting third-party risk that will make our missions fail and ends up costing more to the taxpayers and to the warfighter? In the private sector, it's the same thing. And I think it's starting to happen, right? So NTIA has a working group on software bill of materials. And in one of the working group sessions, we got a readout on the financial sector. And it's already starting to happen, right? Where what we were told is that high finance, they get a requirement for a new capability. And the engineering team designs the system and say they need software from company X. But they're not allowed to do any acquisition. The risk management group comes in and they look everything over and they say, okay, we don't know anything about company X. And they have a discussion with company X. And what we're told is that the first thing they ask them is, do you have a bill of materials that gives us the provenance of where your software came from? And if they say yes, they're like, okay, well, you know, it's in its infancy, show us what it is. At least you're caring somewhat about security, we'll look at it. If they say no, they say, okay, two things are going to happen. Either we're not going to do business with you, or the price that you're asking, we're not going to pay. We're going to lower that price, because if we just buy it, we're bringing risk into our enterprise, and we're not willing to do that. So we're going to figure out what the risk is. We're going to negotiate a much lower price, and if we decide to do business with you, we'll do it with you at that level. So that's going to happen a few times, and that company is going to kind of figure out, you know, maybe it's cheap, maybe it's more effective for me to make that investment in the first place. And I think that's what I mean by globalism is fading, in that what's going to happen in the business world is party A can no longer blindly trust party B when there's a penalty for pulling that risk in. So when a company realizes that they could be facing a lawsuit, a class action lawsuit from their shareholders, or the next company that they want to do business with walks away because they're not paying attention to their security, yet some of these other companies that I'm now collaborating with, their CEOs have reorganized along supply chain security. That's a game changer. So yes, it's going to cost more, but there's an economic motivation to do it, because if you don't, you're going to lose market share.
Got it. Brilliant. I think we're out of time. I want to thank you again, Chris, for an outstanding presentation. I always learn so much when I listen to your talks. Appreciate it very, very much. And for all of you that are on the call, the next CIRI webinar will be on October 22nd at 3 p.m. Central. It'll be Professor Jana Diesner, who will be talking about advanced data analytics in use to improve humanitarian assistance and disaster recovery. So we hope you can join us then. Chris, thank you again. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
Bye-bye, everyone.